Tonight on Ukraine Today, historic defense deal. Zelenskyy and Macron have signed a document that will seriously boost Ukraine's combat aviation and air defense. A Ukrainian strike in Russia's Kursk region drones hit a key plant of the Russian military-industrial complex. The situation on the battlefield. DeepState reports enemy advances in the Donetsk region. What are Ukraine's defenders saying? More pressure on Russia. US Republicans are preparing new sanctions against all countries trading with Moscow. A scandalous statement by Orban. Why is the Hungarian Prime Minister dragging his own citizens into the war and putting them at sanction risk? All this and more, right now. Hi, I'm Volodymyr Robchun, and this is Ukraine Today. Please subscribe, hit like, and let's get to the news. We'll start with a historic deal aimed at strengthening Ukraine's combat aviation and air defense. The document was signed by the presidents of Ukraine and France, Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Emmanuel Macron. It provides for additional SAMP-T systems, air-to-air missiles, air bombs, and also the sale of 100 French Rafale fighter jets to Ukraine by the year 2035. Joint defense project will also begin later this year. We'll return to President Zelenskyy's foreign visits in a moment, but now let's move to Russia's Kursk region, where Ukrainian drones hit the Tsinkum plant. It produces materials for the Russian army, meaning it is a fully legitimate target. Ukraine's defense forces managed to destroy key components of Russia's air defense system in Novorossiysk. More about this and other highly effective strikes on Russia's military and fuel infrastructure in the next report.
First of all, at least 4 were destroyed, and secondly, 2 radars were also eliminated. And that's not counting the fact that a dozen such systems could have been damaged.
New details, new conclusions. It turns out that the strike on Novorossiysk on the night of November 14th marked not just the collapse of Russian oil supplies, but also became the most powerful blow to Russian air defense systems throughout the entire war.
Ukraine carried out one of the most devastating strikes against Russian air defenses. It destroyed 4 S-400 launchers and 2 radar stations from this battery at once.
Ukrainian media reported this yesterday, citing sources in the Security Service of Ukraine, SBU. It became known that 4 S-400 Triumph launchers were completely destroyed. They were located on the territory of the Kuban Red Banner Regiment's military unit. In total, there were 12 such launchers at the site. The Security Service believes that some of the others were also partially hit. As a result, the entire division has been put out of action.
If anything is overlooked in this regard, then when these launchers need to operate, an emergency situation could occur, which could again lead to the detonation of the launcher or cause the missile to fly off course. Well, in general, there could be a wide variety of potentially different consequences in this case, if some seemingly minor issue is overlooked. Basically, the entire base can now, at this stage, be written off completely at this point in time.
At the same time, 2 expensive radars were destroyed at once. These were from the same long-range air threat detection and target acquisition complexes, which were the ones guiding those very S-400s. At the same time, even multi-million-dollar losses are not the main issue here. What's more important is that right now, the Russians simply have nothing to replace the lost equipment with.
Well, while it's still somehow possible to replace the launchers, it's extremely difficult to replace the radars, as you know. Because each radar is a high-tech instrument, and under sanctions, assembling them is very difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. Here, it's 2 radars at once, and both were operating as part of a specific battery. In other words, the battery has fallen apart. Now it needs to find new radars. In other words, eyes, without which air defense is useless.
What exactly our defense forces used to strike Novorossiysk still remains unclear. It's likely that it was the SBU operating drones. However, several Ukrainian special services were involved in the attack at once, so analysts agree that the strike was a combined one.
You just need to make a wish at night. Maybe that was the wish for Novorossiysk. You see, wishes have a way of coming true. So this is the kind of menu from the defense forces, and it's always a pleasure. But seriously, if we're talking about the systematic nature of these strikes, it's so systematic that they hit 2 or 3 times.
It's also worth noting that the destruction of military equipment and port infrastructure in Novorossiysk is just the culmination of the entire operation, which was carefully prepared, and along the way, many other Russian targets were destroyed.
To reach Novorossiysk itself, they first had to strike Crimea. Literally the day before, there were strikes on Feodosia and at the same time on the Feodosia oil depot. The Kurovsky airfield near Feodosia was also hit, as well as the Feodosia Air Defense District. This is what allowed our missile operators and drone pilots to reach Novorossiysk. This is a very high-value target.
At the same time, the same sources in the SBU add that for now, an entire air defense division in Novorossiysk has been put out of action, leaving a huge gap in Russian defenses which will undoubtedly be exploited by Ukrainian drones and missiles.
A Ukrainian ground robot has eliminated an enemy fighter for the first time. The K2 brigade sent the robot toward 3 Russian soldiers and then triggered an explosive device. One occupier was killed, another was wounded. And soon after, both he and the 3rd Russian soldier were hit by an FPV drone. Over the past 24 hours, Russia has lost at least 1,160 occupiers, killed and wounded. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, that's already 1,159,420 Russian soldiers. In addition, in the last day alone, Ukraine destroyed 2 Russian tanks, 3 armored vehicles, 17 artillery systems and dozens of other pieces of enemy equipment. Ukraine's defense forces pushed the enemy back near Shachove in the Donetsk region, according to DeepState. The enemy, however, advanced in Volodymyrivka and near Sofiivka. More on the situation on the battlefield in our report.
Pokrovsk is on the brink. It seems that soon the Ukrainian armed forces may have to retreat and abandon the devastated city. Such grim forecasts are being made more and more often by Western military analysts. Even the Ukrainian command acknowledges the difficult situation on this section of the front. However, for now, there is no talk of surrendering the city. Our soldiers continue to methodically drive out the occupiers entrenched in residential buildings. There, the enemy is desperately trying to set up strong points.
The situation in the city itself is difficult. There are ongoing, intermittent battles, and accordingly, we are clearing out individual houses and separate streets. In certain situations, enemy special forces infiltrate specific areas, set up ambushes, and accordingly, try to adjust fire from both drones and artillery onto our positions. But now we have already mastered the enemy's tactics in the city. So accordingly, we are localizing all these points.
The fighting inside the city is for every block, every building, and even individual entrances. Neither side has full control over Pokrovsk. Nevertheless, the Russian army, disregarding its losses, is desperately trying to storm the Ukrainian city.
The enemy has tried to come in from the north multiple times. We reinforced our positions there and also struck from the flanks. They also tried to activate several directions from the south, including sabotage groups and even the movement of armored vehicles. But we carried out counter-terrorist operations against the groups, and as for the vehicles, we eliminated their firepower.
The losses suffered by the occupiers near Pokrovsk are so massive that Russian contract soldiers are refusing en masse to take part in local assaults and are simply fleeing their positions. The Russians no longer retrieve their wounded and dead from the streets, and their evacuation teams are being reassigned to assault units. This state of affairs does nothing to boost the occupiers' morale. According to our partisans, the latter are practically deserting in entire groups, deliberately destroying their own equipment beforehand.
Agents report the disappearance or desertion of several of their fellow servicemen after a series of precise strikes by Ukrainian defense forces on Russian troop positions on the outskirts of Pokrovsk. Command posts, equipment parking areas, and UAV units were hit. Some Russian servicemen link the desertion of Russian soldiers and the strikes on Russian armed forces positions to each other. Some believe that these servicemen were directly involved in this.
Those few desperate ones who foolishly decide to stay at their positions near Pokrovsk face a slow and painful death by starvation. And that's because the defense forces have completely cut off the main supply route for food and ammunition to the occupiers. At least 2 airstrikes were carried out on the road that the Russians had managed to use to bring some light equipment into the city, after which the enemy was left without a supply route. Now, the occupiers can only reach their positions on foot, and even then, only a handful managed to do so thanks to the heavy fire from the Ukrainian armed forces. Recently, Russian soldiers have resorted to all sorts of tricks just to avoid being spotted by Ukrainian drones. One of the latest, unparalleled Kremlin inventions is these kinds of shells. Our defenders have already nicknamed them tin cans. They don't make the occupiers any less visible, but they do get opened up by FPV drones just like real cans. No matter what corner the occupier tries to hide in, our drone operators will fish him out from there too. A vivid example of this is right now on your screens. A concrete pipe and a haystack, which the Russian soldier used for cover, did not save the occupier. Credit must be given to the Ukrainian pilots. Each time they managed to infiltrate even the most heavily fortified enemy positions and precisely strike enemy equipment. It's gotten to the point where our FPV drones are starting to fly right inside Russian shelters. When an FPV drone flies into a dugout or an ammo depot, the occupiers simply have no chance of survival. And the best proof of this is the latest statistics from the armed forces of Ukraine. In the past 24 hours alone, the aggressor country's army has lost about 1,000 of its soldiers. The total losses of the occupiers since the start of the full-scale war have surpassed 1,158,000 people. The Ukrainian armed forces have already destroyed 11,350 Kremlin tanks, more than 23,500 armored combat vehicles, nearly 35,000 artillery systems, and 1,541 multiple launch rocket systems.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. And now's the time to subscribe to the channel, hit like and share a few videos. It takes less than a minute and really helps the channel grow. Thank you and glory to Ukraine.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Balaklia in the Kharkiv region has come under a Russian missile strike. The occupiers hit a residential neighborhood. At least 3 people were killed. Several injured, including 4 children. Apartment buildings, a kindergarten and cars were damaged. Russian forces also attacked energy and port infrastructure in Odessa region with drones. Thousands of homes were left without power. At a port in the Odessa region, the occupiers struck a ship sailing under the Turkish flag, carrying around 4,000 tons of liquefied gas. A new video has emerged from temporarily occupied Bakhmut, once a beautiful Ukrainian city. It has been turned into ruins by Russian invasion forces. These images really make my blood boil. Stalin reached Berlin in 4 years. Now, after almost 4 years of war, Russia hasn't even come close to Kyiv, and it won't. These are the words of Finland's President Alexander Stubb. Speaking to the Associated Press, he said he didn't expect a ceasefire or peace talks this year. According to Stubb, such developments are unlikely before February or March. Until then, he added, the pressure on Russia must only increase. US Republicans are preparing new sanctions against all countries trading with Russia. This was stated by US President Donald Trump. According to him, Iran may also be included in this list. Peace talks between Ukraine and Russia are back in the international news cycle. Turkey has once again spoken about their necessity. Given Istanbul's crucial role in past negotiations and President Erdogan's influence on Putin, this statement carry weight.
Recep Erdogan will once again bring Ukraine and Russia to the negotiating table. According to Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, negotiations between the warring sides are inevitable, and the only place acceptable to both countries is Istanbul.
I think this war is now going through its worst phase because both sides are focused on destroying transport and energy infrastructure. Now it has turned into a drone war. No one can move anywhere. Only those who disregard losses are advancing.
In addition, regarding the intention to resume the negotiation process, Vladimir Zelensky mentioned the Russians in his address.
We are working to initiate another round of negotiations so that there is at least some prospect of ending this war. And we are also counting on the resumption of exchanges. There are many meetings, negotiations, and calls happening now for this purpose.
The first positive step towards possible negotiations was the agreement brokered by Turkey and the UAE on a large-scale prisoner exchange. According to the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, this concerns the release of 1,200 Ukrainians. Donald Trump is also counting on a swift end to the war. The US president believes that the sanctions imposed on Russian oil companies are motivating the aggressor to make concessions.
I hope this will happen soon. There is enormous pressure being put on India because it buys Russian oil. And thanks to this, they have money for the war. That's why I think this will end soon.
During the negotiations in Istanbul in the spring and summer of 2025, Moscow did not change its previous unrealistic demands on Kyiv, including denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine.
But they are well aware of our position. They have, as I already mentioned before, our position on paper, and it's no secret at all. It was voiced by President Putin in June 2024 when he spoke at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Moscow's intentions can only be judged by its actions, and it has made it clear what it wants. It wants the rest of Donetsk region, and obviously Ukraine will not agree to this. Right now, we see that Russia continues to carry out long-range strikes on Ukrainian territory, obviously aiming to destroy its energy system and, so to speak, demoralize the country.
On the one hand, the Kremlin does not want to stop the fighting for negotiations. On the other hand, Russia is coming under increasing pressure from the newly imposed sanctions against oil giants Lukoil and Rosneft, Ukrainian drone and missile strikes on oil refineries and ports, as well as Putin's reluctance to lose dialogue with Trump.
The Russians are now trying to somehow shake up, well, this diplomatic ice, to break it in various ways. Let's say through both formal and informal diplomacy. Right now, they're working on the G7 using communication channels. They have tried, most likely, to resume the Istanbul negotiation process again. But in any case, the Russians are not ready to accept Trump's ultimatum, and Trump's ultimatum is very simple. Any political negotiations will only begin when the fighting stops.
At the same time, in reality, specifically on the battlefield, the Russian occupiers are only increasing the intensity and frequency of their assault operations, continuing their offensive in the Donbas and Zaporizhia directions.
President Zelensky visited Athens on an official trip. He met with the Greek president, the prime minister, and the head of parliament. They discussed, among other things, energy security and Greece's role in helping return Ukrainian children abducted by Russia. Greece's DEPA commercial SMSA and Ukraine's Naftogaz signed a contract for the sale of American LNG. It will be delivered from Alexandroupolis in Greece to Odessa in Ukraine. Deliveries will start in January 2026.
This will be another route for gas supplies, just to secure as much as possible the import routes for Ukraine during the winter. We already have agreements on financing gas imports, and we will cover the need of almost 2 billion euros for gas imports to compensate for the loss of Ukrainian production after the Russian strikes. The government of Ukraine has allocated funds for the imports, and our European partners are helping. European banks are helping under the guarantees of the European Commission. Ukrainian banks are helping too. Norway is helping as well, and there is active work with our American partners. Full financing will be provided.
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban decided to remind the world he exists by making yet another scandalous statement. In an interview with Politico, he said Ukraine has no chance of winning the war against Russia and that financial aid to Kyiv was pointless. Orban said the key question for him is whether Hungarians can stay out of the conflict. Because, in his words, everything he has done in the past 15 years given Hungary a chance to avoid being dragged into the war. That's what Orban said. What he didn't say is just as important. That through his words and actions, he openly supports Russia. And by doing so, he has already dragged his own citizens into the war on the side of the aggressor. He's already putting them at risk of sanctions, already distancing Hungary from the EU. Seems like Orban is worried not about the well-being of Hungarians, but about keeping Putin and the Russians happy. And finally, football. Ukraine's national team has defeated Iceland in the final match of the World Cup 2026 qualifiers. The game in Warsaw ended 2-0. This spring, Ukraine will play the playoff matches for a spot at the 2026 World Cup. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment and share. See you next time.